This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW, flyers. That is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 490, part 2, entitled The Masculist Gender Political Attack Initiative. Carrying straight on. When the para is pushed onto the feminazis by the masculists, their typical feminazi reaction is one of horror, of fear, of deep threat. So the masculists are able to see in broad daylight the utter hypocrisy of these fluffy feminists in all their two-faced duplicity. These feminazis want the right to reject an unwanted pregnancy as women, but expect men to be man-slaves to them if they as women do decide to go ahead with the pregnancy. This attitude of these fluffy feminists just generates real hatred in masculists who sneer at them. And if whole populations continue to be wiped out, then masculist soldiers will simply go out into the streets and shoot them for their massive gender crimes against men, manslaving men for decades. Masculists argue that manslavery is a far greater crime than was Negro slavery in the 1800s, which was the root cause of the US Civil War, in which over 500,000 soldiers died. If the gender laws are not soon men-fared, for example, the divorce courts reformed, the para-legislated, gender equality committees set up in the parliaments that address both men's and women's gender political issues equally, then there will be increasing threats of a sex war by the masculists who are fed up with the bigoted monoconsciousness of the feminazis, which is why we masculists label them feminazis. They are as callous towards men as they are ignorant of how they oppress men. As masculism spreads and spreads, so that young men are familiar with masculist arguments, then young women will not dare state publicly that they are feminists, since if they are stupid enough to do that, it will mean the kiss of death for them in terms of getting a man. Since if nearly all men in her social circle had been filled with masculist ideas, then she will be rejected by her social circle, both socially and sexually. She will be cast out as a hated, manslaving, parasitic, bloody fluffy, and spat at. As more young men become familiar with masculist ideas, then the equivalent of the masculist diatribe in public audiences at the universities, mentioned above, will take place in group conversations on a massive scale, millions of them, across many countries, as very angry, hateful young men attack the fluffy parasite attitudes of monoconscious feminist women, expressing their masculist hatred of such women, punishing them severely by totally ignoring them, telling other members of their social circle, especially other men, that, quote, Jill is a real fluffy. She really wants a manslave to pay for her. She's a fluffy crapper who's studying a fluffy crap major that will make her economically useless, incapable of earning good money, so will then expect a parasite of some gullible, stupid, manslavable man, expecting to manslave him for decades of his life, then drag him through the hated, fluffy, feminist-dominated divorce court system and financially crucify him, living off his alimony for the rest of her manslaving, parasitic life. So for God's sake, Tim, avoid women like Jill, like the plague. Sure, she has nice titties and gives a good blowjob, but she's toxic. She's a bloody fluffy. She's career incompetent and really wants to get her financial claws into some stupid manslavable man. Don't be that man. Ignore her. Leave her rotting on the shelf, manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, and spat at, forcing her to get off her fat parasitic ass and fip up, or she's going to have an utterly miserable life, which is what she deserves, the hated, fluffy, manslaving parasite. End quote. When there are enough Masculists on campus and word gets out to the journalists that there is a new gender political ideology that has real teeth, that is making real inroads into the university's zeitgeist, then the journalists will be intrigued and they'll write stories about it. Masculist journalists will then attack the bigoted monoconsciousness of their feminist journalistic colleagues, lashing out at the level of ignorance and callousness towards men coming from these monoconscious feminazi bigots, that's MFBs, haranguing them for their ignorance and putting enormous moral pressure on them to become biconscious, telling them that it's actually in their self-interest to become biconscious, since a biconscious feminist is much more likely to have a boyfriend, since she will be much less feminazi bitchy towards men if she learns that women oppress men worse than vice versa. Her feminist anger at men for the ways that men oppress women will be cancelled by her female masculist anger at women for the ways that women oppress men. She will lose her feminazi anger at men, which will make her much more approachable by men. So she will then benefit from having one. Increasingly, with the rise of masculist ideas, those women who remain monoconscious will be severely punished by men who will simply force them to rot on the shelf. Men don't want relationships with women who are monoconscious feminazi bigots and punish them severely by totally ignoring them, spitting at them for their massive gender crimes against men as presented above. Men want relationships with women who are snurfs, that's slim, nurturative, fips, and put powerful psychological pressure on women to be snurfs or pay a heavy price by not getting a man. Feminazis to men are repulsive and are the first category of women to be rejected by men. The Masculists push women to be very conscious of that fact. They say to women, if you're a real misandrist, male-dumping feminazi bitch, then you will pay a very heavy price. You will not get a man, since men find women like you repulsive and will avoid you like the plague, forcing you into manlessness and hence lovelessness, sexlessness and babylessness, rotting on the shelf, rejected by men and increasingly by society as masculine ideas spread across the culture. So if you want to get a man, become biconscious or continue to rot in hell, you monoconscious feminazi shit. End quote. Expect in the coming few years large numbers of explosive, verbally violent exchanges between biconscious masculists and monoconscious feminists on campus, as the masculists express their rage and hatred at the ways that women oppress men, and particularly towards the hypocrisy of the MFBs, monoconscious feminazi bigots, who know nothing of how women oppress men, so feel justified at lashing out at men for the relatively minor ways that men oppress women, given that women oppress men far worse with their decades-lasting man-slaving parasitism, their many decades-lasting gender crimes against men, for example, paternity fraud, in brackets, in about 5% of pregnancies the husband is not the father. Women's pill line, where she tells her man she's on the pill, but isn't, who wants to get pregnant, does so, then by law forces him to pay for a kid he doesn't want, thus manslaving him for years. Women's tooth and nail opposition to the legislation of the para, when women have the mara, which is sheer, utter hypocrisy that causes masculists to hate fluffy feminazi bigots, these callous, hypocritical shits. Once there are large numbers of masculists, the time will then be ripe to get the gender laws changed, the most important of which will be the establishment of the gender equality committees in the parliaments, which will consist half of female feminists and half of male masculists, whose job it will be to treat the gender political issues of both, in capital letters, sexes equally, which is far from being the case today. In today's hypocritical world, the term gender equality in most people's minds is synonymous with women's equality. And the notion of men's equality doesn't even enter the heads of most of these MFBs. Once these gender equality committees exist, their job will be to mend-fair the gender laws, For example, reform the divorce courts. That is, in brackets, throw out alimony, which is the parasite's charter. Give custody of the kids jointly by default, so that young men are prepared to be fathers again, close brackets. Legislate the para. Boy fair the schools by increasing salaries of male primary and secondary teachers so that boys have male role models, etc., etc. There are many masculinist issues to be tackled across the board. These committees will be responsible for the creation of a FIP society, one of the major goals of the Masculists, as a political program. They will express the attitude and powerful moral expectation that, quote, now that women can work, they must work, or be seen as man-slaving parasites who will be rejected from society, spat at, shunned, isolated both socially and sexually. End quote. The time is now ripe for masculistic men to rise up, to express their anger and hatred at the massive gender injustices committed against men, to lash out at the feminazis who continue in their callous, monoconscious ignorance. We will see millions of verbally violent confrontations between monoconscious feminazi bigots, that's MFBs, and biconscious masculists in the coming years, and it will not be pleasant for the women, since men are smarter than women on average by 4 IQ points, and the fact that men have a 10% higher IQ variance, so the genii are males. With male masculist genii really attacking the MFBs, these poor women will not stand a chance. They will feel crushed, as they should be. The time is now ripe for masculistic men to lash out, to men-fair the gender laws, to put powerful moral pressure on women to get off their fat parasitic asses and FIP up, or be severely punished by men by being forced to rot on the shelf, totally ignored by men who won't go near them, since such women are seen by men, by masculistic men, who in time will be most men, as immoral, man-slaving, fluffy, parasitic vermin to be exterminated slowly by being totally ignored. That is their punishment that they deserve. The rise and rise of masculism will prove to be as historically important as the rise of feminism. It will force women to FIP up, to grow up, to take responsibility for their own lives. It will liberate men from decades of man-slavery to women and free men to pursue their own dreams, doing what men want to do, rather than spending decades of their lives being man-slaves to hated, man-slaving, bloody, fluffy parasites. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Author of the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Man-Slaves to Women, an e-textbook of 490 plus Masculist flyers for men's studies courses, freely downloadable in Microsoft Word format from my website. Ciao.